All I can remember is his head flipped forward and then it just banged back up against the wall. And he was the same thing, soaked in blood, and I didn't get a good look at like what his injuries look like.
Melrose is a small, unincorporated community in Florida, just 17 miles east of Gainesville. Originally, the area was inhabited by Native American tribes before European settlers arrived. The community of Melrose began to take shape around the shores of Lake Santa Fe and was eventually named Melrose after Melrose in Scotland. Throughout the 20th century, Melrose evolved from an agricultural hub into a residential and recreational community. Today, Melrose maintains its small town charm, and it's known for its thriving art scene. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbours and take care of one another. But on the 26th of August 2020, the fabric of Melrose was forever changed. That morning, detectives raced to a home along the rural Shiloh Road. A report had come in that 2 boys were found dead. Tayten Scott Baker was born on the 12th of June 2006 to parents Chad and Sarah, who'd been married since 2005. His younger brother, Robert Andrew Baker, followed on the 18th of September 2007. The family also included a little brother, Landon, who joined them in 2016. The boys also had 2 older half-brothers, Colton and Colby, who had come from a previous relationship that Chad had. Close in age, Robert and Tayten were inseparable, truly the best of friends. Their great-grandmother fondly recalled. They were wonderful boys. They were awesome. They never got in no trouble or anything. They were just good kids. The brothers shared a love for video games, outdoor play and swimming. Their bond was so strong that when Robert received scholarships to attend private schools, he turned them down just so he could stay close to Tayten. Their older brother, Colby, affectionately recalled.
Tayten was Robert's big teddy bear. He was the best. He cared for all the animals. He cared for all his family. He was planning on going and playing football for high school and college.
On the 10th of August 2020, the family packed up their belongings and moved from Lakeland to Melrose, a town just south of Jacksonville. The move was motivated by a desire to be closer to the family in the area, especially their cousins, which thrilled the boys. They settled into a 4-bedroom home on Shiloh Road, a relatively rural and secluded area, yet familiar and comforting, since Sarah's parents and grandparents lived in the same neighbourhood. Sarah recalled.
The old couple passed away, and when we purchased the house, it was like fully furnished, and she might have been a little bit of a hoarder, but...
The homes were affordable and spacious, providing an ideal setting for the family's new chapter. Sarah explained the motivation behind the move.
To be closer to my family. I was having a lot of difficult times. Started getting severe depression, anxiety. So I thought if I moved closer to my family that my dad would be able to help me out of my shell a little bit more. And we had a bunch, of plans, and the kids were excited to move up here to be closer to their cousins, even though they had lots and lots of friends down there.
It was summer when they moved, and Tayten and Robert settled in easily and anticipated starting their new school. 14-year-old Tayten was described as a happy-go-lucky boy who never spoke without smiling, lighting up any room with his presence. Known for his gentle soul and heart of gold, he made friends effortlessly and was always eager to help his brother or anyone else in need. Tayten loved to cook, listen to music, and play outside in the garden. But what excited him the most were the upcoming family camping trips and the adventure of starting a new school. 12-year-old Robert was both smart and athletic, excelling in almost everything that he tried. When he received scholarships to private schools, it came as no surprise to the family. He was deeply interested in robotics. Robert loved playing basketball, video games, and fishing with his friends and family. He had a special connection with animals and nature, eagerly anticipating family camping trips and fishing trips, especially with his papa, who lived just down the road. The boy's grandfather, Andrew, lived with his wife, Deborah Benson. They were over the moon that the boys were going to be so close by. Deborah fondly recollected. So many plans were made. Fishing, camping, beach, birthday parties, weekend parties. I truly felt that life was perfect. I remember actually saying that out loud, that life is finally perfect. It was a warm morning in Melrose on the 26th of August 2020. With summer drawing to a close, Robert and Tayten had been eagerly anticipating their upcoming adventure, starting at a new school and making new friends. Though they missed their old friends from Polk County, their easygoing and friendly nature reassured everyone that they would quickly find their place. Sarah, their mother, was the first to rise that day. As she stirred from sleep and rubbed her eyes, she was struck by the unusual stillness in their usually bustling home. It was almost 10 a.m, yet the house remained eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the lively morning she was accustomed to. Chad was away on business, working as a long-haul truck driver, and Landon was asleep peacefully beside her. But when she woke most mornings, she could hear Tayten and Robert, either playing video games or watching television. Sarah rose from her bed and made her way to the den. As she entered, her eyes were immediately drawn to a blanket on the floor close to the pool table, drenched in blood.
I started seeing blood on the ground on the other side of the pool table. So then I started getting closer and closer and seeing more blood, and I ripped off my son's blanket because I thought it was like he was a picker on scabs. I didn't realize how much blood it was at the time because I just opened my eyes. But when I ripped off the blanket, it was everywhere. It was covered in blood. I did try to flip him, see where the blood was coming from. His head at the time was facing one way, and I know I faced him the other way trying to feel for a pulse, which I never did.
Panic surged through Sarah as she rushed at the blanket, yanking it up to reveal the lifeless body of 12-year-old Tayten. His small frame was soaked in blood, and his throat was nearly severed by multiple deep cuts.
He was laying on his tummy with his face facing the wall. You could tell that his throat was severed completely through almost to the bone. That's when I realized there was no pulse.
Sarah's scream pierced the morning stillness as she called out for Robert to call police, but the house remained eerily silent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raced to the living room as dread clawed at her insides. There, her eyes fell upon another blood-stained blanket on the floor. With trembling hands, she lifted it up.
All I can remember is his head flipped forward and then it just banged back up against the wall. And he was the same thing, soaked in blood, and I didn't get a good look at like what his injuries look like, but I did as far as Tayten's.
Sarah grabbed Landon and sped over to her father's home just down the road. She burst in, frantic and hysterical, screaming that she believed her children were dead and begging for someone to call 911. The boy's grandmother, Deborah, took one look at Sarah and knew that something was terribly wrong.
She said, Debbie, call 911. I think my kids are dead.
What was her demeanor?
She was terrified and panicked, and I remember her nightgown was ripped, and then her little Landon came running behind her.
What did you think? What did you do?
I didn't believe her. I was completely confused. What do you mean your kids are dead? Both of them? How? There was a lot of questions, and then she said, wake up. Or my little son he goes, I'll go get Dad, and there was just a lot of panic, and I died.
Deborah quickly jumped into her car, called her husband Andrew, and dialed 911 as she drove back to the family's home. She hoped against hope that Sarah was mistaken, but as she cautiously stepped inside, it became heartbreakingly clear that Sarah's worst fears were true.
We went straight to the pool room and I saw Tayten, and he was laying face down on the ground, and I knew immediately when I saw him, and I told the operator, I said, yes, he is dead, but I still tried to like shake him and call his name, even though I just knew. And so I was just like shaking and grabbing at him and saying, Tayten, Tayten, but I just saw blood, and I just thinking of Tayten, and then it occurred to me, Robert, where is Robert? So I looked around and started to walk up the steps, and then I seen Robert's feet, and they were just whiter, the whitest feet I'd ever seen. So I walked up a few more steps, and I saw his face, and I saw his face was just pure white, and his lips were bluish purple, and blood was everywhere. And I took a step back because I just was in disbelief. It didn't make sense. I didn't know, and I said, Robert's dead too, or said something like that, and the 911 operator told me to leave the house.
Both Tayten and Robert lay lifeless, their throats slashed with such force that bone was visible. Just as Deborah stumbled back outside, Andrew pulled up. She told him that Tayten and Robert were dead. Overcome with grief, he screamed and pushed past her into the house, only to confront the same horrific scene that had shattered their lives moments before. Detectives arrived at the scene 12 minutes after the 911 call came in. Much like those before them, they entered the home only to confirm that both Tayten and Robert were dead, and far beyond resuscitation efforts. Tayten and Robert's bodies were transported to the medical examiner's office, where the pathologist determined the brutal nature of their deaths. Both boys had been slashed and stabbed with a knife on their throat, and then bludgeoned across the head with a hammer. Tayten's throat had been slashed multiple times, with the killer attempting to saw through his neck. The large escaping wound to his neck was 3 to 5 centimetres wide by 5 centimetres deep. His head also had evidence of bludgeoning from a hammer. Robert's throat was slashed from end to end, nearly decapitating him. The pathologist, Dr. Fuller, explained.
So, it is my opinion that these satellite incised wounds indicate that this injury did not happen with one pull of the blade. This injury took multiple movements of the blade. Because we don't have large wounds in here, more likely than not, the blade was cut in, and then there was movement back and forth, and as it comes up, it creates these satellite injuries. So this does represent multiple lateral movements of the blade.
There were additional injuries to his head caused by the hammer, including a depressed skull fracture.
So I cannot tell you whether or not he was conscious in this particular case. I can tell you his heart was beating. He was alive. Because of the blood and the contusion, that this would not occur. This scalp hematoma would not occur if he were dead and hit in the head. You still have a fracture, but you're not going to have the blood because there's no perfusion. There's also pictures of the brain which show contusion. That would not happen if the heart wasn't beating. Also the neck, the blood loss, the hemorrhage around that. The heart had to be beating during all these events, but that does not mean they're conscious.
Back at the crime scene, investigators meticulously searched the home. They found bloodstains that indicated that Tayten had managed to crawl away before succumbing to his injuries. This showed a very disturbing reality. Tayten was alive as his throat was slashed down to the bone, and alive long enough for him to crawl away. During their search, investigators found a hammer and a fillet knife wrapped in a towel, both stained with blood, under a sink in the game room. Over at the crime lab, Tayten's blood was found on the hammer and knife, while Robert's blood was found on the knife. As news of the double murder spread across Florida, the sheriff's office released a statement which read, "An autopsy concluded today confirmed the deaths as homicides. This is still a very active investigation. Detectives said that Robert and Tayten's parents weren't considered suspects, and that their father wasn't home at the time. Chad had worked as a long-distance truck driver. The community was truly horrified by the brutal details of the boys' deaths. Robert and Tayten were innocent children, and they had met a violent and tragic end. In their shock and sorrow, the community rallied desperately to support the family as they navigated their profound grief. Neighbours and friends thought of ways to help, offering condolences and assistance in any way they could. A GoFundMe was set up, and within less than a day it reached its target of $8,000. But over the next couple of days that swelled to more than $22,000. The GoFundMe read in part, Tayten and Robert were good kids who were loved by everyone. They loved playing video games, swimming, and hanging out with their family. They had dreams and goals for their life that they will never be able to fulfill. As part of the investigation, detectives meticulously interviewed everybody in the family, seeking to uncover whether anyone harboured any ill intentions. Part of the investigation also focused on how the murders were committed without anybody hearing a single thing. Detectives did an experiment to figure this out. They all stood in different parts of the house and called to one another, made noise and banged on the walls. Sure enough, because of the layout of the home, they couldn't hear each other through the walls. The process of looking into the family, their friends and any acquaintances was thorough and tense, each question peeling back layers of their lives. But it wasn't long before a suspect emerged from the shadows. Sarah told detectives that after they moved to Melrose, she allowed her sister, Cindy, Cindy's boyfriend, Mark Wilson Jr., and their baby girl, Caitlin, to live in an outbuilding on their property. Prior to the move, Cindy, Wilson, and Caitlin had intermittently stayed with Sarah's family for several years.
They either didn't have a place to stay, or Cindy was, the most recent time she stayed before that incident was because she was pregnant, and where they were staying was not, I guess you would say, sanitary, healthy. I mean, I don't know what word you would use. She had no running water and things like that, and at the time she was 6.5 months pregnant. So that's when I made them come stay with me, and she started seeing a doctor right after that.
Cindy and her family had been living in a place with no power and infested with fleas. About 5 days before the murder, Sarah let them move in as they had no other place to stay and a young baby to care for. But things took a negative turn one afternoon when Sarah visited them in the outbuilding. She found the couple smoking marijuana in the presence of their baby.
I actually said, get your stuff together, and then I told them to get in the car, which they did. We did leave there without the baby being in a car seat at that time. And then I said, I can't remember my exact words, but it was to the lines of, if you guys can't get your shit together, then I'm going to have no choice but to turn it over to TCF to get other people involved in helping. But they agreed to move to my house, so none of that was a big issue. I mean, it was an issue if they didn't want to come and stay, but they wanted to come and stay.
Sarah said to detectives that she didn't notice anything unusual about her sister or Wilson's demeanour the night before the murders. However, she did witness something strange.
I seen him again that night on the back porch, which my back door led to the porch where it says back patio, where I went outside to go smoke. He was out there sharpening his knife.
At the time, Sarah didn't think much of it, but in hindsight, it set off alarm bells. Detectives began focusing on Wilson as a person of interest, and it wouldn't be long before compelling evidence emerged. The day after the murders, Christy Adkins went to the Baker household to comfort Chad and Sarah. She was the mother of Mark Wilson Jr. As she left, Wilson and his girlfriend accompanied her to spend the night at her place, about 15 miles away. After the turmoil of the day, everybody went straight to bed. The following morning, Wilson's girlfriend joined Chrissy in the kitchen and casually remarked, "Mark needs to cooperate." The possibility that her son could have been involved in such a horrific crime had never crossed Chrissy's mind. But it was no secret that detectives had already considered him a person of interest. With a sinking feeling, she went into the bedroom where Wilson was sleeping and urged him to speak with the detectives and take a polygraph test to clear his name. Wilson groggily rolled over and began getting out of bed to put his pants on. He then responded, "Mom, I can't do that." Christy was stunned, uncertain of his meaning. She asked, "Why, Mark? Did you hurt those babies?" Looking down at the floor, he quietly replied, "Yes, Mom, I did it." Horrified, Christy felt her world shatter. She knew what she had to do. Without revealing her intentions to her son, she left immediately and went directly to the sheriff's office. Christy sat down with the detectives and recounted exactly what her son had said. Determined to help the investigation, she agreed to wear recording equipment to try and elicit a detailed confession from her son. Christy picked up Wilson and drove around Putnam County, with detectives following close behind. She pleaded with her son to explain what had happened. On the recording, her voice trembled as she said, "I need an answer. I need to know why. Why did this happen? You're my child. You're my son. Why can't you tell me?" Wilson then quietly responded that he was responsible for the murders. His mother then demanded, "For my own peace of fucking mind, what flipped your mind to make you hurt them?" What Wilson said next shook Christy to her very core. He replied, "Cindy did, and my daughter." According to Wilson, he thought that Cindy was meant to kill Sarah and Landon while he was killing Robert and Tayten. He said, Cindy was supposed to do the first half, referring to Sarah and Landon. Christy expressed anger and bewilderment, replying to her son, "This is not real. This is not real. You're my son. You're my baby." However, he then said that he only believed this, and that Cindy hadn't actually said anything to him about the murders or wanting to kill Sarah and Landon. He said that there was something in his head compelling him. After making the confession, Wilson stopped responding to his mother. Detectives who were trailing close behind decided to pull them over, and they arrested Wilson then and there. He was transported to the police station, where he was asked about the murders of Tayten and Robert, unaware his mother had covertly recorded him. At first, he expressed surprise, telling the detectives, "That's crazy. Those boys were like family to me." He continued to deny any involvement in the murders, but something within him changed when detectives showed him photographs of Tayten and Robert's mutilated bodies. Wilson looked horrified. He covered his face with his hands and sobbed, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." The detectives then played audio of Wilson's conversation with his mother, and eventually he broke down and admitted to killing Tayten and Robert. Wilson told detectives that on the morning of the murders, he was high on methamphetamine. He said that he'd been awake taking the drug for the past 3 days. Wilson said he felt that the Baker family had been tearing his family apart, and added that Cindy fucked with his head. According to Wilson, he loved the boys, but he suspected that they were abusing his daughter or having some kind of a sexual relationship with his girlfriend. He said, "It would be like if somebody was making your wife and your daughter do shit and hide it from you and keep you walking around." He said that this was the motivation behind the murders, but then suggested a second motivation. He said he believed that Sarah and her family were coming for him and his family by threatening to call the Department of Children and Families. Wilson told the detectives that when he killed Tayten and Robert, he wasn't angry. He commented, "It's really foggy. I wasn't really conscious." He described the murders more like a bad dream than something that actually happened. He stated, "I'd been thinking about it and just psychological fucking hell." In reference to his girlfriend Cindy and her alleged involvement, Wilson said that Cindy never actually said anything to him about killing anybody. He said that he just thought that she wanted the boys and Sarah dead, telling detectives. "She was making me feel like it was something that I had to do, you know, but without saying it." After Wilson was arrested, detectives looked into the claims he had made during his confession. He said that Robert and Tayten could have been abusing his daughter, or could have been having some kind of relationship with his girlfriend. However, detectives couldn't find a single shred of evidence to back these claims up. Wilson had also said to detectives he believed that Cindy was going to kill Sarah and Landon, but once more, there was no evidence to corroborate this. The detectives next searched the outbuilding where Wilson had been living with his family. They came across a letter he had written, and it was dated the morning of the murders. In the letter, Wilson expressed love for Cindy and their daughter, but also mentioned getting frustrated and coming across as angry or confrontational. He spoke about their daughter in the letter, describing her as extraordinary and our greatest accomplishment. He then added, "I can't lose you two. Please promise you will always know that her father is a soldier and that he loved you from day one and will always love you both until the end of time." After Wilson was arrested, he provided a DNA sample. When this was compared to the DNA found on the knife at the crime scene, it came back as a match. The sample showed that he was 55,000 times more likely to have handled the knife than anybody else. After announcing the arrest of Wilson, State Attorney R.J. Larissa announced, "I can tell you I've been working in the criminal justice system since 1980, and these are some of the most brutal murders that I've ever heard of. He attacked those two kids without mercy." He said that the Baker family had done a lot to help Wilson out, and this was how he repaid them. The state attorney also said that while he believed the murders warranted the death penalty, he needed to review the case and speak with the family. The fact that the killer had been someone that the family welcomed into their home wasn't lost on the community. It struck fear into the hearts of parents, especially parents who have offered a helping hand to a family member in need. Colby Baker, one of the boys' older brothers, touched on this when he posted on Facebook. "It be the people that you let live with you, the people you called family, the ones that acted as if they cared, that will really fuck your whole life up. I really hope you rot in there, and I hope you get the maximum sentence possible, you sick fuck." Wilson was subsequently charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and was ordered to be held without bond in the Putnam County Jail. During his court hearing via video link, he asked for a public defender instead of a personal lawyer. This request was approved by Judge Howard McGillen. After speaking with the family and looking at the facts of the case, in October it was announced that the death penalty was going to be sought against Wilson. He was further charged with 1 count of burglary with battery and burglary while armed. State Attorney Larissa said that the factors in deciding the death penalty was that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious and cruel. He further said that they believed that they were committed in a cold, calculated and premeditated manner. Putnam County Sheriff Gator DeLoach commented that his thoughts remained with the family and said that the crime scene was one of the worst he had ever seen in his entire life. He stated, "We're confident that with hard work of our deputy investigators, victims advocate and the state attorney's office, that we will provide justice for Robert and Tayten and provide closure for the family." The trial was pushed back several times because of the COVID pandemic. But in the meantime, kids returned to the mega sports camp at Living Hope Church in Florahome. Tayten and Robert had been at the camp in 2019, which had been led by pastors Dave and Tammy Spedden for more than 15 years. Each new camper was given a blue and orange wristband in memory of Tayten and Robert. Tammy recollected. Tayten had celebrated his 13th birthday one of the days of the camp, and we brought him to the platform to sing happy birthday to him. Their funeral was held at the church, and we wanted to do something special this year. In their memory, coaches at the camp were asked to pick a Camper of the Week award based on character and participation. Each camper was then presented with a medal by Tayten and Robert's father, Chad. By the 12th of October 2022, the jury was selected and seated, and opening statements were ready to begin. Prosecutor Jennifer Dunton was the first to take the floor, and she said to the jury that Wilson had carried out a premeditated attack against the Baker brothers.
The defendant and Cindy got up early around 6:30 a.m. dark outside, and they went to the Circle K to get donuts and coffee. They returned back to the Baker home, and Cindy goes into their outbuilding apartment to feed her child. And you will learn that it was at that time that the defendant obtained a hammer from one of the buildings on the property. He armed himself with his fillet knife, and he entered the Baker's home with the intent to kill those boys. The boys were sleeping when they were attacked. The defendant bashed their heads in with a hammer multiple times. And just to make sure they were dead, he later told detectives, he also slit their throats.
During defense attorney Courtney Davidson's opening statements, she didn't dispute that Wilson had killed the brothers. However, she argued that his actions don't match the charges against him. She said to the jury, "This is a tough case, a very tough case. A case where Mark shows remorse and takes accountability, but it is not a case of first-degree premeditated murder." The testimony got underway with Tayten and Robert's mother, Sarah, describing the horrific moment she found them dead. She told the jury that after moving into their new home, they had struggled to get Wi-Fi throughout the property. As a result, the boys often stayed in the living room so that they could use their cell phones before bed.
So in the meantime, my children slept in different areas wherever their phone would get service. So they could watch YouTube or their video game streaming or whatever they normally did to keep them occupied. One always slept here, one always got service over here in this corner.
Do you remember who was always in which room?
Yes. Tayten was always in this room, the game room, and Robert was always in the living room.
She recollected the gruesome discoveries that morning, telling the jury, "In that moment, I started screaming at the top of my lungs." The boy's grandmother, Deborah, was the next witness, and she described Sarah coming to her home in a state of hysteria, screaming that somebody had killed the boys. She said that at first she didn't believe Sarah, but it soon became all too clear that she was telling the truth once she entered the family's home. She recollected, "I was shaking and grabbing him, saying, 'Tayten, Tayten.'" After Deborah's testimony, the prosecution presented the hammer and knife that was used during the murders. Sarah had testified that she saw Wilson sharpening the knife the night beforehand. The jury also got to hear the tape recording that Wilson's mother, Christy, had made. Christy described going to detectives with what her son had told her because it was the right thing to do. Wilson's defense team opted out of calling any witnesses. They provided no defense other than to say that Wilson's crimes failed to constitute as first-degree murder. During their closing arguments, defense attorney Brian Smith said that mediation on a crime must be long enough to allow for reflection. He argued that in the recording of Wilson's confession, he didn't appear to have thought about the murders at all before he committed them. He stated, "Reflection isn't what we saw in that interview. Where's the reflection?" During prosecutor Jason Lewis's closing arguments, he refuted this claim. He argued that Wilson displayed numerous instances of reflection when he slashed and bludgeoned Tayten and Robert dozens of times. He also said that Wilson displayed reflection when he left the outbuilding, entered the boys' home, retrieved a hammer and a fillet knife, and attacked the boys in 2 separate rooms. He said to the jury, "This is not a case where the evidence is difficult. This is a case where the evidence is straightforward, and it's a mountain of evidence." Prosecutor Jennifer Dunton also made some comments during her closing arguments. She pointed to the note that Wilson had written to his girlfriend, asking her to remember him well and tell their daughter about who he was. Dunton said that this letter proved Wilson planned on committing the murders. She said to the jury, "Why would he need to write this kind of note? There was no evidence that they were in danger of breaking up. It's very clear, now that the trial and evidence is over, that the defendant thought about killing these boys." Family members turned away and covered their eyes as Dunton presented photographs of Tayten and Robert's autopsies. She then stated, "Every blow takes force, and there's a chance to stop. Every step of the way, there's opportunities to stop and reflect, realise what you're doing, and not continue." It was now up to the jury to determine Wilson's fate. They deliberated for just 2 hours and 15 minutes before they returned with the verdict. They found Mark Wilson Jr. guilty of first-degree murder, as well as guilty of committing armed burglary and burglary with assault or robbery. As the verdict was announced, Wilson looked to the ground, but somebody from within the public gallery let out a joyful yell of excitement. Outside of court, Sarah said she was grateful for the jury's decision and hoped that Wilson received the death penalty at the upcoming sentencing. The penalty phase of the murder trial began on the 15th of October. While Wilson's defence team were seeking a life sentence, the prosecution were hoping for a death sentence. Prosecutor Jason Lewis underlined the impact of the attacks in his opening statements. He reminded the jury that the boys had been slashed and bludgeoned dozens of times. He stated, "Robert and Tayten will never get to go to high school. They'll never go on a first date. They're never going to drive a car. They're never going to go to college. They are dead, and they are dead because this man sitting right here brutally and viciously killed them." He called on the jury of 12 women to assign Wilson the death penalty, referring to it as the only fair and just sentence in this case. During defence attorney Rosemary Peoples' opening statements, she made no attempt to excuse what Wilson had done. Instead, she asked the jury to consider his background and broken mind. She said to the jury, "Tears and sorrow will never undo Wilson's actions, and for that he must be punished. We're not going to ask you to forgive Mark. We're not going to ask you to like Mark. We're going to ask for your compassion and your understanding. We're going to ask for your mercy." Testimony was then presented about Wilson's upbringing. Pamela Wilson, his aunt on his father's side, said that while she came from a highly educated family, at least one member had ongoing problems with substance abuse, alcohol, and drugs. She further said that this person had gone to prison for 5 years for a sex crime. Pamela told the jury that she once witnessed her father hit Wilson in the face so that he could take his seat. Pamela referred to this as abuse, but when she was cross-examined by Prosecutor Lewis, she said, "It was harsh discipline." Pamela said she never saw any signs of trauma or bruising on her nephew that would indicate he was being abused. Wilson's mother, Christy, then described to the court how his father, Mark, was abusive towards her. The abuse had begun when she was 8.5 months pregnant with her son. She recalled an incident where he had been drinking with friends in their bedroom until 3 a.m, and she asked him to leave so that she could sleep. When they did, Mark flew into a rage and threw her around the room. He spat on Christy, poured beer on her, and then threatened her with a broken glass. He told her, "If you ever leave me, I will kill you." She said that this set the basis for the rest of their relationship. Christy recalled countless other experiences just like this one, where Mark choked her, and even placed their dog in the oven and switched it on. However, despite his violence towards her, Christie said that she never saw Mark abuse their son. She eventually left Mark and gained joint custody over Wilson, but said that Mark only ever looked after Wilson because he knew that it upset her. She recollected, "He was not going to let me take Mark. It was the only thing Mark Sr. knew that I loved and cared about." But then one day Mark vanished for several years and took Wilson with him out of state in violation of their custody agreement. She only saw her son again after Mark abandoned him in Oklahoma. The jury then got to hear from toxicologist Susan Scully Danziger, who had spoken with Wilson about his history of substance abuse. Wilson had started smoking marijuana when he was just 10 years old, and had then begun using crack cocaine when he was 12. Apparently taking drugs was a family event in Wilson's childhood, as the toxicologist testified. It was like family all sitting around together smoking a bowl of marijuana. That was sort of the daily habit. Wilson was dependent on methamphetamine and alcohol at various points, and at times he would smoke crack cocaine 4 or 5 times per day. Scully Danziger said to the jury that regular use of such drugs can have lasting effects on the brain. According to several experts, the toxic home environment that Wilson grew up in caused permanent changes to his brain. Dr. Stephen Nelson said that fight or flight hormones can enter a baby while a mother is pregnant and can affect brain development. He said that growing up surrounded by abuse can have that same impact, even if the child is not the one being abused. Dr. Nelson told the jury that scans showed abnormalities in parts of Wilson's brain associated with memory, stress response, and impulse control. During Dr. Nelson's assessment of Wilson, he was told of the challenges he faced while growing up, such as whether he was going to have enough to eat or have clothes to wear. He testified, his fight or flight instinct essentially had to be on all the time. He concluded that decades of drug use had taken its toll on Wilson, as did sleep deprivation immediately before the murders. He said to the court, all of these factors combined made it such that at that moment he was unable to make proper decisions. It appeared to him at that time to be the best decision. Wilson had also been analysed by licensed psychologist Michael Quinones, who diagnosed him with numerous adverse childhood experiences as well as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. He said that at least once a day, Wilson experienced intrusive memories of an incident where his father had put a gun to a woman's head. He said that these and other factors most likely harmed Wilson's social skills and brain development, telling the courtroom. Chronic stress has a debilitating impact on an adult's ability to function. The defense testimony concluded with a brief interview with Wilson's 22-year-old sister, Kayla Woodard. She said that growing up, Wilson was somebody that people looked up to. She described how when she was nervous for her first day of school, her brother walked her to the classroom and supported her. The prosecution began their arguments and called on Dr. Tonya Werner. She said that while Wilson claimed he was high on methamphetamine at the time of the murders, she found no evidence to support this. She said that in her experience, when people have recently taken a large amount of meth, they typically appear hyper, agitated, paranoid, or aggressive. Even with medication, it takes a couple of days for that to clear up. But in contrast, after the murder, she found Wilson clear and not disorganized or psychotic. She also found no issues with his cognitive function or memory, except for when she asked him about the actual murders. Forensic psychologist Dr. William Meadows agreed with her assessment. He said that Wilson's claims were inconsistent with real memory problems, telling the jury, amnesia is not going to be selective for the most negative parts of your case. It's certainly not going to start when you kill somebody, then stop when you go to a medical centre, then start again when you provide a confession to your mother, then start again when you lie to the police, and that's what I observed. He said that Wilson appeared to be malingering or faking his memory problems. The courtroom then fell into a hushed silence as victim impact statements began. Sarah's voice was tight with emotion as she said, "Every day I wake up. I have to get through another day, and I'm faced with the pain, the hurt that my family and I now have to face for the rest of our time in this world. As this trial ends and the world continues to spin, I will still be left here staring at 2 teddy bears, 2 stuffed bears that contain the ashes of my own children. That is all that I have left in this world of my wonderful boys." People wept in the public gallery as Sarah described her boys. She said that Robert was strong-willed, hard-headed, and incredibly smart. She said that if he actually had been given the chance, he would have made the world a better place. As for Tayten, Sarah said his smile was so big and he was always smiling no matter what was going on. She commented, "Everywhere he went, he made friends." The boy's father, Chad, also took to the witness stand to describe them. He touched on Tayten's passion for cooking and Robert's love of baseball. Chad was out of town when Wilson killed his boys, and he recalled losing to Robert in a game of pool just before he left. His voice quivered with emotion as he said, "Robert told me he was going to kick my butt when I got home. I told him, we will see about that, and that he'd better practice." Deborah, the boy's grandmother, recollected how she went to the emergency room twice in the wake of the murders because she felt like her heart was being physically crushed. Each time she was sent home with a diagnosis of grief. The boy's cousin, Kelly Coco, described how each holiday felt like a punch in the gut because it was a memory they couldn't create together. She said, "I'm filled with grief and depression. Some days I still can't get out of bed." Colton, the boy's oldest brother, read aloud a letter that had been written by the boy's best friend, Mark McCumber Jr. He said, "Let's just say this. Losing Robert and Tayten Baker, I lost me. Let me tell you how I no longer play sports because it's what we did together. I no longer go fishing, and I love fishing, but when I go, I think of the boys so much and how much they loved fishing." Mark's statement continued, with him saying he looked at the wall each day and reminded himself that while Tayten and Robert might not be there in person, they're always there in his heart. After 4 days of testimony, closing arguments were presented. Prosecutor Dunton said that Tayten had defensive injuries to his hands. She said this showed that he tried to defend himself as his throat was slashed. She said after this, Wilson bludgeoned him over the head with a hammer. She stated, "It was completely unnecessary, caused a hideous amount of pain, showed a complete indifference to the suffering of another human being." The prosecutor said that even when Wilson admitted to the murders, he failed to provide meaningful details or help detectives understand his motive. Defense attorney Peoples, in contrast, argued that he gave so little information simply because his brain didn't function properly. The jury then went off to deliberate Wilson's fate. It took them less than an hour to decide that Mark Wilson Jr. deserved to die for the gruesome murders of Tayten and Robert Baker. But the decision on whether or not that would be carried out was up to the judge, and he needed time to think it over. After the verdict, the family spoke with the media. Though relieved that the ordeal was finally over, lingering questions haunted them. No one could fathom what had caused Wilson to snap and kill the boys. Sarah even mentioned that Wilson had been on good terms with Tayten and Robert leading up to the murders. He had recently taken them fishing and fixed up their dirt bike. She stated, "He was just really kids-oriented, more than he was towards even my sister or me." The family were stunned when they learned from testimony that Wilson wasn't even on methamphetamine at the time of the murders. Wilson had given so many varying descriptions of what drove him to carry out the murders, but really, none of them made any sense. The family returned to court on the 28th of January 2023. Judge Howard McGillen asked Wilson to stand, as he stated, It remains solidly within the discretion of the court to make a final decision. As a judge, however, one remains mindful that we do not sit to impose our own biases and preferences upon the parties. That's something that's overlooked in today's society. As a judge, it's our role to be neutral and independent arbiters of facts and law. He said that the defendant had committed 2 truly horrific murders of innocent children, and said that Tayten's death was particularly cruel. He said that evidence showed Tayten was alive and suffering for some time throughout the assault, including when his neck was sawed with the blade. The judge said that while the mental health and childhood trauma that was presented are proven in the abstract, the court found no proof they were relevant to the murders. He then officially handed Mark Wilson Jr. a death sentence.
The defendant is remanded to the custody of the Sheriff of Putnam County to be held and transmitted to the Department of Corrections and to be held there in close custody pending imposition of a sentence of death in a manner prescribed by law. On such date as may be set by proper authority, the defendant shall be put to death for this offense.
Outside of court, the boy's cousin, Kelly Coco, said to the media that while the family were relieved, there would be no real closure. She stated, "I think that's the hardest part. You never feel safe, you know. The boogeyman is always outside, not inside." Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, Kaylika. You can join Morbidology up on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and there are absolutely no obligations. You can cancel your subscription at any time. In exchange for your support up on Patreon, I upload ad-free and early release episodes of Morbidology, as well as bonus episodes of Morbidology Plus that aren't on the regular podcast platforms. I also upload behind the scenes, which includes case files, audio and videos when available for the episodes. And I also send out a handwritten thank you card along with some cool merch. If you'd like to support the show in another way, please consider leaving me a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I genuinely do appreciate the feedback and take it all on board. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.